Hello, my name is Roger Watson. I'm from the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Hull, and this session was first delivered to the Health Professions Education module at the Hull York Medical School. The session is entitled Online and Asynchronous Teaching and Learning. As the diagram suggests, to some extent, online teaching and learning is the same teacher using a different set of tools. What isn't true, however, is that online teaching is simply a matter of taking what you do in the face-to-face environment and putting it online. There are some significant differences. So in this session, I'm going to look at online learning and teaching and outline that. And what I want to do is to focus on asynchronous teaching and learning and to try to impress upon you what the advantages of asynchrony are in online teaching and learning. I'm sure you realise that asynchronous means out of time, and in fact this session is being delivered to you asynchronously out of time. It's been designed and put up on the web a long time before you've actually listened to it, and essentially that is the essence of asynchronous teaching and learning, something that's not done at the same time as the two people are together, the teacher and the learner. I think some people's impression of online teaching and learning is that they do it face-to-face but online. In other words, they replace the classroom with an online environment and give the lectures to people who are sitting listening at the other end, which is essentially the same as face-to-face teaching. However, that can be used as part of online teaching and possibly plays a valuable role. However, as I say, this is about asynchronous teaching and learning, and I emphasize again, I want to try to get across to you some of the advantages and indeed some of the disadvantages of that, and to give you some hints and tips about how to do it as well as you possibly can if you do decide to use online and asynchronous teaching and learning. I want this session to be practical and helpful to people who may be considering doing online and asynchronous learning and teaching. So I want to avoid as much as possible theoretical considerations of education as such and theoretical considerations of online learning and teaching specifically, although I will mention tangentially something about theory, but it won't be much. As I say, I want to make this practical. So I want to look at some definitions of online teaching and some different models of online teaching and learning, obviously including asynchronous learning and teaching. And then, such as it is, I want to look at the evidence for the effectiveness of online teaching. I have to say that there's not a great deal of evidence in this field, but there is one major report that I'll point you to, and it's specific to health, so you may be interested in that. And I also want to give some practical hints and tips about how to be effective with asynchronous online learning and teaching. The first definition is a general one of online learning, and before I give it, you can read it yourself, but I will read it out to you and break it down. You'll notice that I'm using Wikipedia, and you'll notice I use that several times in this presentation. I'm a great fan of Wikipedia, despite the reputation it gets. I'm also a contributor to it. Wikipedia is only as good, or indeed as bad, as the people who are willing to read it and to improve it, and anyone in theory can make improvements to Wikipedia. Anyway, this is not meant to be an advert for Wikipedia, so I'll read out the definition and then say a little bit more about it. Online learning involves courses offered by post-secondary institutions that are 100% virtual, excluding massively open online courses. Online learning, or virtual classes offered over the internet, is contrasted with traditional courses taken in a brick-and-mortar school building. So essentially, online learning is usually delivered at university level. I know that schools use a great deal of online material and virtual learning environments, but they rarely deliver what would be considered to be online courses. You'll notice there that massively open online courses, or MOOCs as they're known, are excluded from this, They're not really part of online learning as such. They're just universities and other institutions making their material available freely and widely on the internet. Although these can form parts of programs, but they're not usually formally assessed. So online learning is contrasted with traditional courses because it's delivered virtually, and virtually can mean synchronously or asynchronously, but essentially it means that it's not delivered in a face-to-face environment within what's called a brick and mortar school building or a university. So you get the idea. Basically, online learning mainly is learning that's done one way or another using a computer and not having to physically be present with the teacher and the learner in the same place. Now, having said that I wasn't going to speak about theory, and as you'll see, I'm not really going to talk much about theory, I want to point you to a book by Terry Anderson published around 2003, The Theory and Practice of Online Learning. It's in its second edition. You may be interested enough to go and take a look at this book. It's edited, so therefore it's multi-authored. The different chapters are written by different people, and I want to just use a couple of diagrams from this book to illustrate something about online learning. And this is as theoretical as it gets. This is a diagram illustrating the types of memory and indeed the process whereby we memorize things. Everything that we learn and therefore memorize comes from the senses, visually, audibly, and in other ways. Within teaching, it's usually visual and oral. This goes into a store where we can only store a very few pieces of information at a time, 6 to 8 pieces of information. It goes into our short-term memory, and then, if we're lucky, some of that will get into our long-term memory, and that from which we can retrieve it, and we can then be seen to remember something. People, of course, have different abilities in terms of memory, but one of the key aspects of getting something into your long-term memory is being able to rehearse it and go over it again and again. If you imagine sitting in a lecture which is traditionally an hour long, I'm not saying that lectures don't serve a purpose. They can serve a purpose, but for two reasons they don't always help people to get things into their long-term memory. Certainly not as a result of sitting in the lecture. For a start, we can really only concentrate for the first 10 to 15 minutes of a lecture. Thereafter, our mind begins to drift a bit. And it seems a little bit ironic that I'm delivering a lecture here and your mind may well have drifted already. But the other thing that you can do with this is you can stop it and go back and listen to bits of it again. You can rehearse it. And that's one of the simple and very useful aspects of, first of all, online learning, and certainly asynchronous online learning, where things are recorded and kept up there for reuse. That's something that you can't normally do if you sit in a lecture for an hour. Sure, you can take notes, then you can go off and look up material, and increasingly these days lectures are in fact recorded on systems like Panopto and put up online, but that is really no substitute for well-designed asynchronous online material, which in itself really can be, if it's cleverly put together and linked to the appropriate sources, a very effective learning resource in itself. So that's why I wanted to consider just briefly the process of memory. Online, and particularly asynchronous online learning, really addresses the issue of rehearsal and getting information into your long-term memory. Without getting something into your long-term memory, you have not learned it, and if it's not there and learned, it cannot be retrieved and used later. This diagram and the one that precedes it, and indeed the one that follows it, comes from the book to which I referred you 2 slides ago. The figure is called the Attributes of Educational Material, and it's an interesting schematic way to lay out the different methods of delivery of education, or for the learner, the different ways of learning. And it lays out that material in terms of how interactive it is, or how independent of time and distance it is. So the higher up the diagram, the more interactive a method is, and the more to the right of the diagram, the more independent of time and distance it is. So if you look at face-to-face teaching at the top left, that's the most interactive method, but it's also the most dependent on time and distance. In fact, it can only essentially be done with the learner and the teacher in the same room, but obviously it lends itself to a great deal of interaction. Something like computer conferencing is also very interactive, but it's independent of distance and time to some extent. And other methods of delivery lie somewhere in between. Now, the next diagram shows you how these materials relate to online teaching. And here you can see that everything except face-to-face teaching can be subsumed into online learning, or by the web as it's called here. Now, this diagram is slightly old-fashioned, slightly out of date, and by no means exhaustive. For example, these days down at the bottom right, in the least interactive and the most independent of time and distance, you'd have methods of delivery and learning like podcasting and YouTube. But I think you see clearly what I mean here is that online learning is by no means restricted to one means of doing things, and that there is a great deal of choice and a great deal of variety within that. But as I've made clear before, I will be focusing here on asynchronous learning, and that most definitely lies at the bottom right end of this particular diagram. Next, another definition from Wikipedia, and this time I want to look at blended learning. And blended learning can be considered to be a kind of halfway house between traditional face-to-face classroom teaching and learning and pure online learning, whether that online learning is synchronous or asynchronous. So it combines elements of both. So the definition given here is that blended learning is an approach to education that combines online educational materials and opportunities for interaction online with traditional place-based classroom methods. It requires the physical presence of both teacher and student, with some elements of student control over time, place, path, or pace. Blended learning models are very common, and they can be online based with face-to-face support, for example in tutorials, whereby most of the learning is done independently and online, or they can be the converse, with a focus on face-to-face teaching through lectures and tutorials, but supported by online material. So the definition of blended learning is very broad. In the University of Hull, there can actually be very few courses that couldn't, to some extent, be considered blended learning, even if that only means putting traditional materials up online and making them available. To some extent, that's a blended model, although it's not a particularly good one, and there are models which are truly blended. So blended learning is essentially a halfway house between traditional face-to-face methods and pure online teaching. If you want to know more about blended learning, I would really recommend this fairly recent EPIC group white paper on blended learning by Donald Clark, and it goes through definitions and pitfalls, criteria and different models of blended learning. So it's well worth taking a look at. It's available on the internet and free to download and free to read. Within the white paper, there's a warning against using what is known as a Velcro model of blended learning. As you know, Velcro is a material that sticks two things together. Some people describe their blended courses as using a Velcro model, but in fact, a Velcro model is not necessarily considered to be a good model. According to this paragraph here on the Velcro model, there's a tendency to go with gut feel and slam some classroom training and e-learning together in a primitive manner. This has been called the Velcro approach to blended learning, sticking things together rather than seriously blending or integrating them into a single learning experience or environment. At its worst, this can mean delivering classroom and e-learning that has no cross-references, contradictory content, and leaves the learner confused. The integration of components in a blend is an important part of any blended learning experience. To make progress, we must think beyond the simple dichotomy of e-learning and the classroom. And finally, we get to asynchronous learning. According to Wikipedia, again, asynchronous learning is a general term used to describe forms of education, instruction, and learning that do not occur in the same place or at the same time. It uses resources that facilitate information sharing outside the constraints of time and place among a network of people. And of course, that network of people can be an online class. As the diagram at the bottom right of the slide suggests, the debate about whether asynchronous is better than synchronous or vice versa is a fairly unproductive debate. They're not the same, they're different, they both have advantages and disadvantages. As you'll have picked up, I'm very much in favour of asynchronous learning, but it has to be done properly. And what I want to look at next are some of the advantages and the disadvantages of asynchronous learning. First, I'll look at some of the advantages of asynchronous learning. The main advantage is better quality. There really is little doubt that the quality of the material that can be offered asynchronously is of a much better quality than that which can be offered synchronously. The reasons for this are basically the platforms. If the recent pandemic situation, which has forced us to work from home and to learn a great deal more online and do a lot more work online, if this has taught us anything, it's shown us that the platforms, of which there are many, that are used to keep in contact and to have meetings with colleagues and indeed to teach, are of variable quality, and indeed they can go down and often not work. With asynchronous material, for example, putting something up on YouTube or on a VLE, it's there, it's available, and unless something catastrophic happens, it won't go down, and the quality can be maintained. The quality of the actual material tends to be better because it can be prepared much more carefully in advance. Convenience is a great aspect of asynchronous learning. I must say, as a teacher who travels a great deal internationally, I find asynchronous learning and teaching suits my lifestyle and my working methods very well, because it's very difficult for me to be in the same place at the same time as my students. So therefore, it's got a much wider reach across time zones and, of course, therefore, a much wider reach across geography. And this is very important, and asynchronous learning really enables us to deliver high quality material across the world to people on the same program who don't necessarily have to come and visit the university. It doesn't necessitate people, as synchronous teaching and learning or synchronous meetings do, of people getting up at terribly early or terribly late hours of the day. People can look at the material within their normal working day. So it's convenient and reaches across time zones. It also affords the opportunity for rehearsal, both for the teacher and for the learner. This particular presentation that you're listening to now I'll leave you to judge the quality, but it's fair to say that it's not particularly long, but it's actually taken me a long time, as does any asynchronous material, to put together. Basically because when I've made a mistake, or as I did a few minutes ago, and ahed, then I've been able to stop and do it again. It's also good for learners because they can quickly stop and repeat a piece or watch the whole presentation again if they want to. So it affords rehearsal for both the learner and for the teacher. Clearly, asynchronous learning isn't without its disadvantages. The main disadvantage, I think, is that it doesn't suit all learners and it requires learners to be mature and independent. Therefore, it wouldn't be at all suitable for primary schools, less suitable in secondary school and really not used there very much. And in fact, I don't think it's all that suitable in the early stages of a university programme until the learners have got a foundation in the subject. I think it's ideal for master's and doctoral level learning, but it doesn't suit everyone, and nothing ever does, of course. For the learners, there's a lack of immediate answers to questions and concomitantly a lack of immediate feedback to the teacher. Assuming that you do want to use asynchronous learning, what are some of the strategies that we can use to make this effective? These are strategies, of course, for the teacher. First of all, make the material dynamic. By dynamic, I mean use different ways of delivering that material, and there is almost an unlimited number of ways in which the material can be delivered, provided that that is available online. Principally amongst these, of course, you can do lectures and record them either on podcasts or on YouTubes, or you can use the built-in facilities of a VLE. I would just say as an aside that the advantages to using independent means of recording and delivery from the VLE mean that these pieces of material will still be available if the VLE changes or goes down. You can use podcasts and YouTubes by other people. You can link to websites, PDFs, and to social media channels. There's almost nothing that you can't do, provided that it is relevant to the programme and helps the students to achieve the learning objectives. And therefore it goes without saying that you need to set clear learning objectives. Because something is online and asynchronous, it's not a free-for-all. It doesn't mean to say that you just put anything up in any order and leave the students to do it by themselves. They must have clear learning objectives for each session and for the overall module or programme. Pace the material. Now, the material can be literally paced by only making it available on certain dates. I don't prefer to do this. I find it unnecessary. The material should be virtually paced in the sense that it should be well organised. So it should show clear progression from one session to another. The student should be aware of the order in which the material's got to be tackled, and each session should build on the previous one and help them to understand the one that follows. Do create space for collaboration between the students and encourage the students to support one another. But do monitor this if you're the teacher. Don't just leave them to it. You must make sure that the collaboration and the talk is appropriate. And you can create collaborative spaces on VLEs using blogs or chats, or simple ways of doing it would be to make sure that everybody knows how to use the email system within the VLA, or that they can contact each other provided everyone gives their consent to that. But do create space for collaboration. I find this very useful myself because the maturity of the students that I'm teaching online, I often learn a great deal myself by taking part in these collaborations. They often find material that I hadn't found before and found very useful, and then might even use in a subsequent version of the module. Provide formative feedback and ad hoc support. Again, that's to do with checking up on any chats or collaborative spaces that you've got in there. but do make yourself available to the students. Just because something is both online and asynchronous, it doesn't mean to say that you press the button to publish the program at the beginning of the semester and then stand back. You must interact with it. But of course, being asynchronous, you can interact with it at your convenience. Learn from feedback and change what doesn't work. Don't change the whole module every time, but do give provision for an evaluation of the module, and if there's something that consistently doesn't seem to be working, do make sure that you address that just as you would with any kind of module or with any kind of program, however it's delivered. And finally, at the start of the semester, and indeed periodically perhaps, check all your URL links, make sure that they all work, because from one year to the next, websites can disappear, YouTubes and podcasts can be deleted or taken down, all sorts of changes can take place. So you must check, at least at the beginning of the semester, that they all work. But do also respond quickly if the students report that a link isn't working. Online teaching, asynchronous particularly, is no use if the material is not available to the students. What about the evidence for the effectiveness of online teaching generally? This report reviews the evidence, and it was commissioned by the WHO in 2017, E-Learning for Undergraduate Health Professional Education. It looks at e-learning generally, including asynchronous online learning. The conclusion here is that online learning, or e-learning as it's sometimes called, is as good as other methods of delivery. It's not necessarily better, but it doesn't seem to be any worse, which is very important. However, if you add to that, and this is me talking and not the evidence, the convenience of asynchronous learning, it clearly has some real advantages. It's as effective, probably, but it allows a great deal of flexibility on behalf of both the teacher and the learner. So there is that aspect to it that lies outside of its actual effectiveness. So it's worth getting this review. It's available online and you can download it. It's free to download and read. Just reiterate that the evidence is that online e-learning can be, and often is, just as effective as traditional face-to-face teaching and learning. Also evidence-based and available online, if you want to download it, is this document, 51 Competencies for Online Instruction by Theodore C. Smith. I'm not going to go through all 51 competencies, you'll be glad to know, but why I do want to draw your attention to this is that these competencies are referenced, so to a large extent they are evidence-based, and it's well worth having a look at. Most of them are quite obvious and most of them are very similar to the competencies you would need for traditional face-to-face learning, but there are some that are unique to online instruction, as it's called here. So that's free to download, and I would strongly encourage you, if you're interested in online learning generally, to get a hold of it and to have a read of that. A final word. Online teaching is not an easy option for the teacher, and indeed it's not an easy option for the learner, but it mustn't be seen as a way of abrogating educational responsibilities. It takes a great deal of thought and a great deal of preparation, and on behalf of the learner, it requires a great deal of commitment. For the teacher, it's very front-loaded and it has to be right. I think I've mentioned some of this already. It takes a great deal of preparation before the program can go up, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, but that's particularly true of asynchronous learning. And it has to be right. You have to check everything. You have to make sure it's right. You can't correct things as you're going through. You can't extemporize. It has to be right when the student accesses it, and it has to be right every time. You need to learn some new skills. Things like YouTubing, podcasting and blogging are very useful skills if you're going to teach online, and they're useful skills anyway. And I think finally you should be willing to share your material. That's why I'm particularly fond of using YouTube, because it's public and available for anyone to use. I don't think that we should be getting into a situation where we make online materials and we keep them to ourselves. I think we should make them freely available outside of the university, outside of the program, and that way, as I have found, people will use your materials, and the more that people share good material, the more that's available for you to use in your online programs if you're designing them. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was useful and possibly interesting. I'm easy to contact on email at the University of Hull on r.watson@hull.ac.uk. If you're interested, you can check my own scholarly record on ORCID. If you've really got nothing else to do, you can follow me on Twitter, and if you're on WeChat, you can get a hold of me there too. Once again, thank you very much for listening.